To welcome everybody to the first meeting of the Stronger Community Select Committee, and I think it would be best if we start by having some introductions. I think if we start with officers first and then members. Thank you.
Paula Harris, Democratic Services.
Hazel Eilert, Scrutiny Manager.
Gareth Walters, Trading Standards and Animal Health.
David Jones, Head of Public Protection.
Hugh Owen, Principal Environmental Health Officer.
Roger Hoggins, Head of Operations.
Paul Keeble, Group Engineer.
Mark Howcroft, Assistant Head of Finance.
The chief was the voice from the back, Chairman. Councillor Val Smith, Lambadic Ward. Thank you.
Councillor Linda Guppy, Roggett Ward.
Councillor Roden, Dixon with Osbaston.
Councillor Laura Jones, Wisham.
Councillor Lisa Dimmock, The Elms.
Morning, everybody. Councillor Anne Webb, Tintern and St Arvans.
Good morning, Councillor Alan Davis, Green Lane, Caldicott.
County Councillor Ruth Edwards. I'm not a member of the committee. I'm just here for observing. Thank you.
County Councillor Roger Harris, the same as Ruth. I'm here to observe.
Councillor Louise Brown, Char Newton Ward, again here to observe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would also like to take this opportunity of thanking the previous chairman, Simon Howarth, and Hazel and Paula for the handover that they have given me, which has been extremely helpful. And I would just like to make the point to new members that this is an apolitical select committee, and I hope that we will all respect that and refrain from using the committee as a forum for furthering our own party's political ambitions. But I look forward very much to working with everybody. So the first point on the agenda is that we need to appoint the Vice Chair. So do we have any nominations for Vice Chair of the committee? Don't always all rush at once. Yeah, would anybody like to nominate anybody else for the position?
Can I nominate Councillor Anne Webb?
I would. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As there's no other nominations, then thank you very much indeed, Councillor Webb. Yes. Do we have any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chair. No apologies this morning. We have a full house.
So we move on to the point 5, which is the open public forum. And I would like to welcome a member of the public that has come to speak to us today. Thank you very much indeed. And if you'd like to address the meeting, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. Peter Sutherland, also representing Lambadic Community Council, of which I'm now a member. 4 points today, I'll keep them brief. 2 positives to start with. The grass cutting round the Usk Island car park and environs, absolutely excellent. Thank you very much indeed for that. And secondly, working with officers of the County Council, we've been doing some interim gate locking of the Usk Island car park at night, and I'm pleased to report from an informal discussion this morning that the new burger van and gate locking system will be in place hopefully by the end of this month. So once again, many thanks for the officers involved in delivering that for us. Much appreciated. Thank you. That's the good news. The bad news is 3 months ago we had a meeting on speeding through Lambaddock, and other than a very informal 2-minute briefing last week, because I happened to be in County Hall, we have heard nothing, and that's very, very disappointing to us. There's some real issues there, and indeed a county councillor noted that there was a vehicle travelling, in his estimation, between 60 and 70 miles an hour through Lambaddock the other morning. That's point one, and I'll give the officers and members a chance just to reflect on that. And secondly, the ongoing issue of what we've loosely referred to as the container park opposite the Usk Island car park, where there's the garage and there's the bodywork repairs shop there. There is now a marquee that's been erected within the environs of that container park. I hear from hearsay, but I add it is only hearsay, that there are people on occasion sleeping overnight there. Members will be aware of the situation at Landsoy, and we are very concerned that there might be a repeat of that in Lambaddock. So those are the 4 points this morning, 2 good and 2 bad, and would welcome the feedback on those issues. Thank you.
Can I thank you for coming along this morning and addressing us and for raising such valid points. And I would like to now invite the officer to respond. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. In relation to the speeding issue at Lambaddock, we did have a meeting with the local county councillor, Councillor Sutherland, and another member of the public and the cabinet member to discuss that. In particular, it's very true. We haven't progressed from there. We had some ideas about how we might look at schemes which would be specific to Lambaddock. We haven't. Yeah. Sorry. We did have. Is that better? Yeah. We did.
Can everybody hear?
No? Can't hear? Try that. Yep. So we have had a meeting with Councillor Sutherland and another member of the public. Yeah. And the cabinet member, the local county councillor, to discuss issues around Lambaddock. We had some ideas came from that meeting of how we might progress matters specific to Lambaddock. We haven't got as far as we would like with that as yet. I would suggest to you, Madam Chairman, it gets referred back to the road safety group, which I believe you will be re-establishing, and that we could pick it up at that venue, at that group meeting. The matter in relation to the catering concession, that is organised. We're grateful to the local residents, including Councillor Sutherland, for working with us to ensure we've managed that in the interim, but we're confident that we'll get that back in place. In relation to what may be happening in the yard opposite, we'll raise that with planning colleagues. I believe it's not actually a highway matter, but I suspect that is perhaps the first port of call for us to pursue that on behalf of Councillor Sutherland.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Sutherland, would it be helpful if you had a meeting with some officers on this particular point following the meeting today?
In relation to the speeding?
Yes.
Thank you. Apologies. With respect, we do feel that we're being battered again. You know, we've had one meeting, now it's being referred to another meeting. From the last committee, people will be aware of the Vincents at Shire Newton. I hope I've got their name correct. But they fought a long battle, and one of their complaints was that they didn't get feedback from the county council. They had to push all the time. While I accept and respect that this isn't necessarily the highest priority for this committee or the county council, we do feel we want some action rather than further meetings, if that's okay. We're more than happy to meet, but I would remind members very gently that there is an offer on the table from a local resident to fund some of the speed prevention measures. That is an opportunity that may not last forever, and I would have thought, given the current financial situation the County Council finds itself in, they might want to take advantage of that very, very generous offer. I hasten to add, it doesn't come from me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sutherland. I think obviously the task group is looking at countrywide policy, not individual cases, and I think that there would be mileage in you meeting to discuss this, the issues that you have that are particular to your area with an officer. So I think, you know, I would recommend that takes place. Mr. Hoggins.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. One further point, Councillor Sutherland's quite right that the offer has been made there, and we are quite conscious of that offer having been made. And you're quite right, as an authority, I'm sure we wouldn't wish to be turning down funding if it, you know, towards a scheme. However, it has to be considered as part of a wider scheme. It cannot be considered in isolation. And we have started work both with Lambadic Community Council and Usk Town Council in relation to what a broader scheme around the Usk and Lambadic Woodside areas might look like. So we are very conscious of the money being offered, but it unfortunately cannot be taken in isolation. It needs to be part of a wider scheme, and that is part of, I understand completely Councillor Sutherland's frustrations around it, but it needs to be looked at in that context as well.
Thank you. I think if I could bring in Councillor Jones first. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to say that I know you've explained, Mr. Hoggins, about the containers and in that yard and the tent not being in your remit. But could I ask that it's been raised, Mr. Sutherland has raised it here, and I know there are a lot of concern about what's happening there, whether you could refer it with a matter of urgency to the planning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I know that also Councillor Brown would like to speak. Councillor Brown is the Councillor for Shire Newton.
Yes, Chairman, thank you. I didn't know whether to speak now or you know, whether as a visiting member I was allowed to speak during when sort of the road safety task and finish group actually came up, or whether you prefer to, I don't know the protocol here as to whether you speak now or later. Thank you.
Thank you. Obviously, we've had an election and the Road Task and Finish group will be meeting, so it is ongoing, and obviously there's been a gap, but that will be continuing. Thank you.
Sorry, Chair. I had a particular concern that's arisen as a result of this group, and I just wanted to bring it to your attention, that was all.
Yes, if you'd like to bring it to our attention now, I think that might be the best thing.
Obviously, a lot of across the whole of Monmouthshire, you know, speeding has been and is an issue for local residents. One of the things that some areas do, such as Tintern, is have community speed watchers. And I know that this is being looked at as part of the road safety task and finish group, but I was somewhat surprised at the response from the police, who actually said that because this review was going on, they weren't going to have any more community speed watch schemes. And it seemed as if the review itself was being used as an excuse for inaction. And my understanding is that the review is about making sure that speeding concerns are taken seriously by all the different agencies. And, you know, I'm somewhat concerned that that's the response I'm getting at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Would you like to add anything to that, Mr. Hawkins?
I think that we could raise that through the group, because it's a multi-agency group. There are representatives from the police and Go Safe members and officers on that group, so that might be the ideal opportunity to raise that if in fact we're finding that the police are no longer cooperating in the interim.
Thank you very much. Do any other members wish to add anything on this particular point? I can only add, Councillor Brown, that this morning there is actually a coffee morning taking place in my particular ward, where the community support officer is encouraging members of the public to go along on this very point of speed watch. So it's not my personal experience that they're not working actively on this particular aspect. So unless there's any other comments that anybody would like to make, I'd just like to thank you for coming along today, Mr. Sutherland, and we will follow this up with a meeting for you. Thank you, and you're very welcome to stay if you'd like to. Thank you. So if we can now move on to agenda item 6, which is to confirm the minutes of the previous meeting, which was held on the 6th of April. If I can ask existing members that were present at the meeting to confirm that this is a true record of the meeting that they attended. Councillor Eason. Sorry, you moved the minutes. Yes. Thank you very much. All in favour? Thank you very much indeed. Yes, so if I could now call upon David Jones to introduce agenda item 7, which is the report, very comprehensive report on public protection. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I won't dwell on the Cabinet report because most of it's covered in the report proper. If it's okay with members, perhaps we'll take questions as we go. As you said, it's quite comprehensive, probably too comprehensive for some. And I think that's one of the issues is if we can have a look perhaps to try and narrow it down to see what members are particularly interested in. We'll obviously look at more specific. It's so vast, I think it's difficult to sort of pick out the bits that you may find of interest. So if I just touch on the covering report, the reason it's here this morning is for this committee to undertake scrutiny of the service with comparison to previous years. The reason for that is that 3 years ago now, time whips by, there were some budget reductions made to public protection over the order of about 10%, and as a consequence of that, Cabinet in January 2015 asked for it to be reviewed 6 monthly by the Strong Communities Committee to see what the impact are of those changes. So that's the reason it's here. 4 services, in terms of this report, there are 4 services covered. We've got Environmental Health Commercial, that's led by Jill Dickin. We covered that last time, so we're not going to cover that because we'll be here till about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. What we'll focus on this morning with my colleagues will be the public health aspects of environmental health, Hugh Owen, and the training standards, animal health elements. To my left, Gareth Walters. So we'll cover those 2 aspects rather than trying to cover the 4. And as I say, if we can take questions, that'd be helpful. The Cabinet report obviously gives a very brief summary as to where we're up to. We are continuing to deliver legal obligations. We've got a number of governing bodies, as you can imagine, and there have been some notable successes. This report covers the 2016-17 year. So in terms of food safety, animal feed compliance, we're complying with that. Major developments, I'm sure Hugh will touch upon. Heads of the Valleys Road, perhaps you think it's transport, it's Sutra, Welsh Government. Hugh and his colleagues spend a significant time looking at construction noise, etc. with that. The other one that's often overlooked, I think, is events. We've got the Eisteddfod, we've got Little Mix coming next month, and we spend significant time and effort advising those organisers as to how to do it safely, not just the health and safety, food safety, water, etc. So those sort of things we'll cover as we go through. I don't think I'll cover anything else on the Cabinet report, Chair. I'll zip straight to the report. If members have got questions, if you can give us the paragraph numbers, because I think some are on hard copy, some are on laptops. If you say it's 2, 3, then we know we are. By way of the report proper, I'll cover some of the main aspects. Obviously, we won't go through it verbatim because that'll take too long. As per 1, 2, we'll look at 2 and 4 for for the purpose of this morning. So we'll look at commercial licensing again. Obviously, licensing to assure members is obviously covered off by the Licensing Regulatory Committee anyway, so their performance is regularly reported through that forum. The purpose I've covered, but to summarise, is about protecting people from harm, promoting health improvement. It is about a fair and just trading environment, and we'll hear from Gareth and Hugh of those aspects. It is about improving the local environment to influence quality of life and promote sustainability. And it's about safety and quality of the food chain. So we look at it from the farm all the way to the fork. So those are the sort of main aspects that we cover. Links in clearly with the 7 wellbeing goals that members be aware of in terms of future generations. And it does tie in with obviously what the CMO says. So in a nutshell, in terms of that summary position, it is about taking a preventative role to try and stop costs and etc. for primary care services. So we can obviously stop neighbour disputes, for example. People get very irate and stressed with that. If we can try and sort of intervene and solve some of those issues, and we'll talk about scams, then clearly that'll have an impact in terms of reduce the impact on the public purse. Resources are there, so that is 30 staff in total in terms of full-time equivalents, covering a range of services. The financial resources under 3.2, so we spend about 1.3 million as a net cost, because obviously you have some income in, for example, licensing and applications in. So the net cost of the service is around 1.3 million for last year. In terms of performance, which is the reason for the report, to assure members under 4, there's a number of governing bodies. There's a few listed there. There's about 12 or so. Food Standards Agency, Health and Safety Executive, Child Institutes, got Drinking Water Inspectorate, Welsh Government and other organisations. There have been a couple of reviews in the year just gone. We've had internal audit look at licensing. So that was a positive report. And also People 2 consultants came in last summer. In terms of the actual overall performance, again, Chair, I haven't got time to go through figure 1 because it does go on somewhat. So if I can sort of guide members perhaps to the narrative under section 5. In terms of the commercial team, that's the food safety, health and safety at work and communicable disease. I think it's an opportunity for members next time, and Jill's with us, to explore that. But just to say, again, success in last year and what we're trying to achieve and what has been very successful is the scores on the doors that I think people will be aware of as you go out and about and eat in restaurants and takeaways. That has had the effect of nudging people up nearer to 4s and 5s. So that's been a very successful campaign. The graph under 511, the colour probably hasn't come out, but the top line is obviously the ones that score 5. So you'll see an upward gradient significantly since we've introduced that scheme, and that's obviously a line up. So don't be alarmed the line's going down. Obviously there's only X number of food premises. If line A goes up 5, then the others as a consequence come down. So there's been success in terms of the hygiene scheme. Like I say, I'm not going to go through that, but some notable success again on health and safety as well. Again, I think people tend to think, for new members, HSE springs to mind. That's construction and it's farming, but it's either HSE or ourselves. So we cover a whole number of different premises: golf clubs, residential care homes, ATS, tyre fitters, etc. The whole catering industry, the St. Pierre's of the world. So we do cover a whole range of health and safety stuff, and I think in the report it touches on some of those interventions to protect some of our more vulnerable members of society. So I think what I'll do now, Chair, is hand over to Hugh. We'll pick up section 5.2. Thank you.
I think, before we do that, thank you very much for that.
Okay.
Are there any questions that anybody would like to ask on what we've heard so far? Members? Councillor Eason?
Go there, yeah.
Can you speak up, please? We can't hear.
We haven't got it there yet.
Councillor Easton, I think you may need to use a different microphone.
How's that one?
That's better, yeah.
Are you hear me now? Yes. Right, go back. 5.21. You talk about inquiries can be regarding a range of concerns, including the threat of landlord harassment and unlawful eviction. And further on in the paragraph, you talk about the Rent Smart Wales in meeting the new provisions of the Housing Wales Act 2014. How will this act deal with issues that we've seen in the south of the county in the last 18 months, where letting agents are responsible for the collecting of dues and not what on the property, yet the landlord can distance himself from the operations that he may carry out himself? How do you link the two together, where harassment may come from the landlord, but the real problem is the letting agent?
Obviously we haven't got to 5.2 yet, but because Hugh's with us, he'll cover the aspect in terms of Rent Smart Wales.
Well, I'm quite sure you were.
Yeah, the specific issue in terms of the letting agent was actually a training standards investigation, so you got the two guys alongside.
Thank you very much. Unless there's any, Councillor Jones.
So I know you didn't cover this, but on 5.23, the environmental protection, give dog fouling the red card. Just got a question. I'm not sure this is the
I think we're going ahead of the agenda. Can we just wait until the officers have addressed those?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we'll get to it in a minute. I really just wanted any questions on what we've discussed so far. Okay. Councillor Roden.
Hello then. Question on item 4.2. And can you all hear me okay? That's good.
I think you really need to speak right into these microphones.
Right, okay. How's that? Are these agencies that are listed overlapping in any way? In that, are they covering the same ground? I'm looking at a cost saving potentially, looking at from the agency perspective. Thanks.
Yeah, so the ones, can we hear me? We're all conscious of the mics on me. The Food Standards Agency, it's only local authorities.
Councillor Jones, could you turn your mic off, please?
Right, are we all okay? Hear that? So the Food Standards Agency is local authority, the only people that deliver food safety enforcements, food standards, feedstuffs. So Jill's team and Gareth's team will be reporting through to that central agency, so that's done once. They also cover the meat hygiene service, which is in a local authority. So hopefully that isn't overlapping. Health and Safety Executive, clearly, they're the ones that deal with construction and what I mentioned earlier in my introduction, and then they'll have an overview in terms of the other stuff that's delivered by local authorities. To answer your question, hopefully not. The Drinking Water Inspectorate, similarly, will look at us in terms of private water supplies, but obviously Welsh Water in terms of the public supply, so they'll look at cryptosporidium outbreaks, etc. So I'd like to think there isn't. I think perhaps the one that may be a bit of overlap is Welsh Government, but in terms, I can't get political, but sometimes you'll have responses to nighttime economy, and they're perhaps not talking to the people that are talking about alcohol misuse, and clearly you would suspect that if there's better liaison within, not too much of a problem, but I think sometimes it gets a little bit blurred at that level. But generally, the ones that are sort of national organisations, and you can say for licensing, there shouldn't be any overlap.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions? I would just like to ask one question. Sorry.
Sorry, in view of the budget had been cut, and we've got 2016-17 underspend, the vast amount of work that's been carried out by, the few people within this department that cover such a vast wide range or dearth of different areas must be sort of acknowledged really and commended, so thank you.
All right, we'll report that. It's always helpful, and we'll feed that back to the officers on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Guppy. So if we can now move on to Hugh's report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I can't wait, all the questions seem to be lined up for me. I'll try not to read verbatim from the paragraphs which start 5.2. And please, perhaps as I'm going through the different sections, if you've got any questions, I'm happy to answer them as I go along, which include dog fouling and Rent Smart Wales. Dave has asked me not to drone on for too long, so I'm conscious of the time, and he'll be nudging me. I'm a principal officer for half of the environmental health team. As Dave has mentioned, the environmental health is split into the commercial team section, which is managed by Jill Dickin, and I'm responsible for the public health team. We still deal with commercial properties, but there are certain distinctions which I'll take you through. My team consists of myself, 4 environmental health officers and 2 technical officers. The 4 environmental health officers are full-time. The 2 technical officers work 4 days a week each. The environmental health officers, including myself, as well as covering a district each, so tend to be localised and build up experience in different parts of the county. We also have a specialist lead, so I'll have an officer who specialises in pollution, an officer who specialises in housing, myself in noise control, and so on. If we move on to 5.21, first of all, housing. So a very important part of our role is dealing with housing quality. We've got a housing team in the council who also deal with housing quantity. So the homelessness side of things, providing accommodation for residents, etc. My team is concerned with housing quality, and in particular with regards to a private rented sector. A couple of as stats for you. 2011 Wales census provided that there were 13% of properties in Wales in a private rented sector. That's 13%. In Monmouthshire, about 10.8% of the households in a private rented sector. So they're estimated around about 4,100 properties. Now, obviously, we don't have a resource, and we're not responsible to go around inspecting all of these properties. The responsibility to make sure that a rented property is up to appropriate standard is quite clearly with a property owner. But it's the role of my team certainly to investigate and to respond to complaints. That's perhaps more on the reactive side of the work. But we know that there are certain types of accommodation which are more susceptible to having problems. Whether or not that's fire safety, overcrowding, and so we also try and do and target those properties and do some proactive work, which I'll come on. Where we inspect a property years ago when I first started, it was, is a property fit or unfit for human habitation? Now we use a risk-based system called the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, and basically every property we inspect on its merits, and we're looking for risks. And the chart titled Category 1 Hazards 2016 17 in front of you. If you look on the bottom, the horizontal line, those are all the sorts of risks, to around about 28, 29 risks which we keep an eye open for. So as risks from falls on stairs, falls out of windows, kitchen facilities, bathroom facilities. But if you have a look at the particular spikes on that graph, and indeed on the other page where we've got Category 2 hazards, the spikes always tend to be in 3 areas, for 3 typical areas of concerns to tenants: damp and mould growth, excess cold, and fire safety. Very pertinent to obviously the terrible disaster which happened in recent days. So when we inspect properties, those tend to be the main issues that we find. Perhaps members will be pleased to note the 2 priority areas for our officers, and have been for a number of years when we inspect properties, are the issues of cold and fire safety. On countless times have I gone to a pre-arranged appointment and a tenant answers the door with a blanket around them or a duvet around them, just purely and simply because the property hasn't got proper facilities for heat in the property. With regards to fire safety, even in a typical 2-storey property, we not only require smoke detectors, but we require interconnected smoke detectors, so that if people are upstairs in bed and there's a fire downstairs, immediately the alarms ring upstairs as well. Obviously, all this work which our officers undertake very often meets with resistance. The vast majority of our landlords, of course, are very good landlords and responsible landlords, and only too ready to take on board our concerns. But of course, everyone's got their own opinion as to what is needed in their own properties, and at times it doesn't meet resistance, and we need to take enforcement action. And we got a suite similar to all other local authorities in England and Wales, a suite of enforcement powers available.
So thank you. Just a small question. With the fire alarms, who installs them? Is it you or the fire service, and how are they regularly checked?
Thank you. So we inspect a property, and we typically, most properties, we find a range of hazards. We then decide how we're going to approach that with the landlord, and it's the landlord's responsibility to install them and to pay them, to arrange contract work as normal. So we would either serve a legal notice, or more typically what's called an informal improvement notice, and write to the landlord with a schedule of works and say, well, look, this work needs to be done. In the initial stage, we would try to get an agreement with the landlord to say, well, what sort of time frame can you do this sort of work? Because what we don't want to do is just launch straight into enforcement action. Enforcement action is very time consuming, and of course is not needed for the majority of landlords. Majority of landlords will take on board what we say. So to answer your question directly, we will point out what's needed, we will say why it's needed, and it's for the landlord then to make sure that work is done. With regards to the testing of alarms, that all depends on the nature of a property. So when you've got houses multiple occupation, where you've got your bed sits and that sort of thing, instead of just having isolated smoke detectors, they'll then have a control panel where the whole system's linked in. And typically, our advice would be that they need to get alarm engineers in to service them twice a year. Having said that, we will still point out that it's their responsibility to carry out or to make sure that weekly checks are carried out. Just by simply going into a property, is the power supply onto the alarm control panel? Does everything appear to be okay? Very often they designate particular tenants who have got to keep an eye on this sort of thing and make notes in a logbook to make sure it's done. Very importantly, conscious on time, but housing, because it's so pertinent, I'll spend a few more moments on this. We work very closely with the fire authority. The members who cover Abergavenny will know that we've had a couple of fires in the town centre of Abergavenny with a couple of properties destroyed in recent years. Fortunately, there weren't any rented properties above or in those buildings. But both buildings were takeaway accommodation. Obviously, takeaway accommodation, they've got kitchens, high turnover, perhaps a number of stoves. So we decided 2 or 3 years ago that we needed to start looking at the accommodation. Needed to look at the takeaway premises to see which of those premises had rented accommodation above. And we know in that sort of accommodation, we've got our particularly most vulnerable people in the communities. Perhaps English is not their first language. They don't know who to go to if they need help. They don't know their legal rights. Very often their property is tied in with their job of working in the takeaway accommodation. And historically, this sort of property hasn't typically been expected because there's a dual enforcement role there. The fire authority are responsible for the common areas, whilst the local authority are responsible for the flats and bedsits themselves. And where you've got dual enforcement, that's always open to confusion, both for the landlord responsibilities and for teams investigating. But we got together a couple of years ago with the fire authority and basically decided and established a protocol that we would go in, we would inspect all of these properties, we would have our fire authority points of contact, and we would make sure that they were happy with the sort of works in the common areas as well that we would require to be done. So that work went so well, and it was led by our housing specialist, Amy Lawton, that we were invited to Fire Authority HQ in Llantrisant last year, with all local authorities in Wales invited, Cardiff, Swansea's, the big city authorities as well, as to a model sort of standard as to how this work and joint working should be undertaken, which was excellent. Bearing in mind some of the larger city authorities obviously have got very large housing teams. Dave's beginning to mumble next to me, so I'll move on. The challenge for us, for my team on the housing and throughout all the work, and when we get to the stats later on, is to, and certainly the challenge for myself, is to make sure that the officers have time to do the very important proactive work. Because our officers could be fully engaged day after day just dealing with reactive complaints. And you'll see by the statistics which we come on later why that's the case, because of the sheer number of complaints that we deal with. But we know that based on public health risk, that there are certain areas of work that we're not going to get complaints about. So somebody living in a rented accommodation above a takeaway whose job is tied in with a takeaway, first language may not be English, etc., they are unlikely to complain to us about the concerns that we've got. So we've got to try and put time aside, and that's where our service plans are very important, to help focus on what we need to do.
Thank you very much, Hugh. Can I first of all ask if any members have got any questions so far? Councillor Smith?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. In view of what you said, if we went later on, we're going to consider the revenue and the capital outturn, the concern with regulations and health. In that report, there are 3 items that I am surprised that it's not being considered for slippage into next year. One is the generic asbestos removal. We're saying no, we can't afford 27,000 towards that. The radon response is, sorry, that's on page 93 of the finance report, but it's all right. But particularly of concern, as a member of the Fire Authority, and I'm not sure what regulation 2005 regulatory reform is, the generic fire safety remedial works. And here again, we're looking at a small amount of money, 5,391, that we're not slipping. And I find it difficult to understand that we are saying fire, and yes, it is a considerable concern, because people are very careless, that we can't as a council agree that this amount of money should be retained in our budget. I find it very, very interesting going through the figures, things that will be allowed to continue or things we will continue not to fund. Relating to fire, one of the regrettable things, the number of people who remove the batteries from their fire extinguishers. And also, Chairman, I need to discuss with our legal people after when it's necessary to declare an interest on certain issues. But I am concerned, you've now made a good case, and yet here we have a report where other individuals in the council are saying it's not necessary to fund these issues.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think you need to differentiate the two. That's property services, that's MCC as the landlord. So, yeah, the asbestos, etc., is us as the landlord, so that would be Rob O'Dwyer, and I think that's part of the finance report. Hughes World is obviously the private sector tenants in property, so we can tackle that. So when you page 93, that's MCC as the landlord.
Yes, I
Property
appreciate
services.
that this is another officer's field of responsibility, but we are all part of the same team, and we should be thinking along the same lines and using a bit of common sense.
Thank you very much, Councillor Smith. I've got 5 people that would like to speak, so if I can take Councillor Eason first of all.
Thank you. Thank you once again, Chair. Are we in the right spot now to ask that question? 5.21, 5.21. Is that yours? The question is really the threat of sorry, got a cough. Threat of landlord harassment related to the landlord been able to evict people, connected to the guy who runs the agency for the landlord, who holds the bonds and things like that. What's the correlation between those two, where you've got harassment on one side and collecting of bonds or trying to get bonds back after the eviction? Because in the south of the county, we had a case which really illustrates a problem between the landlord on one hand and the letting agent on the other. You were aware of the case, no doubt. It did cause some concerns for some of my constituents over that matter.
My team, I don't believe, had direct involvement in that case. I think that was more a case taken on by Gareth's team, if I'm right, Gareth, in Trading Standards. Just one quick point on harassment issues. When we get complaints of harassment, always, very often there are two sides to the story, and the tenant certainly has their own powers to consult a solicitor and ability and legislation to protect them on that side of things. They can also, the police can also deal with issues of unlawful eviction or harassment. Very often, environmental health will respond to such complaints, and we'll take statements, and then we'll take advice from the legal team. That's how we tend to approach it. Haven't been directly involved in this case, so Gareth.
Yeah, and quickly touch on. I was going to mention it later. Obviously, as it was a great result. But letting agents themselves don't actually come within our remit. Yeah, it's on the bottom. It's just not shown on the top. Is it picking me up at all? Not picking up. Should I use yours? There we are. Yeah. Right. Letting agents themselves aren't actually caught by our legislation. It normally applies to estate agents. But there's been a lot of problems identified across the UK. This instance was exactly what you're referring to, really, the problems with non-placement of tenancy deposit bonds, which is a legal requirement under housing legislation, but actually doesn't actually create any offences. So we were able to use our general offences and the consumer protection regulations to sort of take this work forward. Obviously, clearly a fraud, and something normally would fall under the police remit. But again, with the police, unless it triggers a certain amount, it's very difficult for them to get involved, because as you can imagine, there's a huge amount of fraud that does go on. And it was only when we dug into it that we identified how many actually people were being defrauded, and suddenly, it sort of hit that trigger point for the police, and that's when it became a joint inspection and a joint investigation. At the moment, there's a consultation out in UK government which is looking to bring letting agents within the control of the similar controls to the estate agency arrangements, and is a national trading standards estate agency team based at Powys, which covers the whole estate agency industry, I suppose.
See, the problem you've got to cover is the fact that the landlord doesn't hold the bond, the letting agent holds the bond. So the landlord has no responsibility for repaying that bond, even though the eviction might have been a right eviction or a wrong eviction or just somebody leaving. The thing is, tenants are taking on properties, but they don't have any protection past their bond, because once their bond has gone to a third party, it's quite likely that, it's possible that that particular letting agent go into, as you say, into a defrauding situation, and the landlord has got no responsibility. How can you correlate and tie the two together to give make sure the landlord has more responsibility for the tenants that he takes on? I say he or she takes on.
Again, from a trading standards perspective, we've got no control there. All we can do is feed that back into the consultation and hope that housing legislation gets amended to sort of accommodate that, and hopefully picked up. Again, the controls are on estate agents, are then applied across the letting agents as well.
Thank you very much, Councillor Eason, for that question. I move on to Councillor Jones. Did you have your hand up earlier, or have you had your arm? No, not yet. Okay. Councillor Brown.
Yes, thank you. Just a quick question. I noticed on the chart in relation to category 2 hazards that it says after, in relation to the largest concern was damp and mould for tenants, and I'm not sure whether the legislation in Wales is the same as in England, but in England you could take action under the Environmental Protection Act for statutory nuisance for tenants to actually take some action so the landlord does something in the magistrates about the mould issue, and I don't know whether that's something that the local authority here does, but obviously that's one of the highest categories that is mentioned in this chart. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, the law is exactly the same in England and Wales. The primary legislation, as with most things that we deal with in regulation, there is overlap. But the primary legislation to deal with damp and mould growth and all these other hazards is the Housing Act provisions. So we certainly got a suite of powers that if there are issues with damp and mould in a property or any of those categories, which we consider serious enough, we can require the landlord to sort them out.
Thank you. If I can ask Councillor Harris, I think he was next, and then Councillor Edwards, and then Councillor Dimmock. Thank you.
Sorry, Chair. My statement was simply that at the back it's very, very hard to hear what's going on. Maybe there's something wrong with the volume that's been set here, and we've got that fan going full bore at the back, which if you're at the back, in other words, something needs to be done to make it better for people in this chamber, and not only people in this chamber, people outside, to be able to hear what's going on in comfort. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
We appreciate there's an issue with the microphones this morning. We've just turned the volume up, so hopefully we can hear you quite clearly, so hopefully that's resolved it. If not, let us know, please.
Thank you. Councillor Edwards.
Likewise, I know Val's got a reasonably strong voice, but we couldn't hear anything she was saying, even with the microphone. So that's all that I was trying to draw attention to. Thank you, Chair.
Hazel.
Please can members actually make sure they speak directly into the microphone, because I think that's half of the problem this morning, is that people are not turning off their microphones when they finish speaking, which means that the sound for everybody else is lower, but you need to actually speak directly into the microphone, please.
Councillor Dimmock.
Just on that, Hugh, with regards to damp and mould, were they actually confirmed cases or was it their lifestyle? I used to work for a damp proofing company, and 9 times out of 10 it was the lifestyle they were living, not opening windows. Was this actually a problem with the buildings?
Yes, you're 100% right. I would probably say 7 or 8 times out of 10 when we receive a complaint that there's damp in a property, that it is condensation related and linked to the lifestyle. In the hazard table that you can see and the numbers there, no, they would have been, because we considered them to be hazards, they would have been because of either penetrating damp or rising damp because of problems with the building. Even if it's the lifestyle of a person, the landlord's still got a responsibility to make sure that they do all they can to help the tenants control condensation levels. So basically make sure that adequate ventilation and adequate provision for heating. And again, you'd be surprised how many properties we go into where windows don't open or heating doesn't work. So just basic things. But yeah, you're 100% right. High percentage of cases it is, where's damp and mould growth, it is linked to the lifestyle.
Thank you very much. Yes, certainly.
Okay, thank you. We're moving swiftly on. Dave's asked me to cherry pick perhaps some of the items that the team deals with. Noise complaints. We get literally hundreds of complaints every year. You've got the graph there which shows a breakdown of complaint types. And a hefty chunk of them, at least 25% every year, are your dog barking complaints. You also get the loud music, the complaints of neighbours arguing and rowdy behaviour. When I first started, over 20 years ago, it was very difficult to decide, well, were these complaints justified or not? And I actually remember having to sleep over in somebody's house to see if there was a problem occurring. Fortunately, now we've got monitoring equipment that we can install in somebody's home and they can carry out recordings for us. We do a lot of proactive work. So once we get these several hundred complaints per year, we do a lot of proactive work, both with our colleagues in the planning department and licensing, to look at development or festivals or entertainment which is proposed, to decide, well, is that going to cause substantial disturbance to residents or not? And we try and exercise reasonable control over those events. Our officers, particularly over a summer period, for some of the bigger events, are very often out noise monitoring late at night on a Friday and Saturday nights. So the recent Balta Festival, for example, on Chepstow Racecourse, a festival in Devorden, our officers were out. Little Mix is coming to Caldicot Castle, so we'll be out again, doing our best to find that balance, and it is a balance, between making sure that there's music there where people can enjoy themselves, etc., without causing perhaps excessive disturbance. Now, with all of these things, they're open to people have got different views as to what's reasonable and what's unreasonable. And we try and strike that balance. Environmental protection. This covers many of the street scene issues. So abandoned vehicles, dog fouling, littering complaints. Very quickly, 2 points on that. Abandoned vehicles are on the rise again. And this is all linked to the price of scrap. 10, 15 years ago, the price of scrap was low, so you couldn't get much for your car, so we had lots and lots of abandoned vehicles. Price of scrap then improved, so nobody was abandoning a vehicle, they were taking it to the scrap dealers to get some money. But again, it is obviously, we all see it, the price of steel, China, etc. You can't get much money if anything, to scrap a car, and we tend to find that very often that we're abandoned. Again, we've got an enforcement role to try and find out who's abandoned these vehicles, but that can be very difficult because very often they're unregistered with a DVLA, and we've also got the responsibility to remove those vehicles. Dog fouling. I know as members on the front line, I'm quite sure you will all receive complaints of dog fouling. Very pertinent to this issue is a balance between enforcement and raising awareness. Around about 2008 and 2009, we decided that for our technical officers, and bear in mind I've got 2 technical officers in the team, but a substantial period of their time would be patrolling the streets to try and find witness dog fouling incidents and give fixed penalty notices. They had some success, but the amount of success, the amount of fixed penalty notices, we just could not justify them spending 50% of their time doing it. And the reason being is when people tend to walk on their dogs and see somebody around, they tend to pick it up. So what we've concentrated on, and it's been pretty successful, is working very closely with town and community councils who want to partner up with us and the Waste and Street Cleaning section with a scheme of Give Dog Fouling a Red Card. And this is all about trying to raise awareness under a single brand. I'm sure if you walk through parks and play areas, you'll see loads of different signs. No dog fouling, Monmouth Borough Council signs, rural district council signs. So we're trying to give it just one simple message, but dog fouling is not acceptable. We've got 19 town and community councils who we work closely with. They're the best attended meetings. We have 2 meetings a year, 2 or 3 meetings a year, best attended meetings that certainly that I attend. And the town and community councils are finding it very, very useful to them. And the number of complaints to environmental health has reduced substantially. I think 2012 we were around 100, 180, 190 complaints a year. For the last calendar year, it was down to 100 complaints. So that's seen as pretty successful.
Thank you, Hugh. Could I just bring in Councillor Jones because she has a question on dog fouling? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Hugh. Oh, that does sound better, doesn't it? I obviously I'm hugely supportive of the scheme, and I think there's been a lot of good work that's been done. I love the fact that you're working together on this rather than everyone doing separate things. But I'm aware of one instance where my son plays football, and it's a persistent problem where dog fouling is still going ahead regardless of there being big signs up, your signs, and I was just wondering who is responsible for those signs, who created those signs. Are they MCC? Is it Welsh Assembly Government? Who makes the signs? Because in my eyes, and many people I speak to, it's not very clear what the sign is about. I mean, from a distance, it's like to do something to do with football, and I love the red card idea, but there's no dog on it. There's not dog isn't a big word on the sign. It's just not clear. So I'm just wondering, is there something to do with that? I mean, obviously you can't have people patrolling the streets all the time, completely appreciate that. But what we do have needs to be good enough to do its job in itself, like the signs.
I appreciate that point. You wouldn't believe the amount of discussion in the early stages of a group about the sort of signs that we should go with. What was decided is that it should be a single sort of sign, but there shouldn't be lots of different signs. And it was fully inclusive. It was members, officers of both Waste and Street Services and Environmental Health. That was the sign that was decided on back on 2014. Which basically says give dog fouling a red card, and yes, I don't know how big the signs are. We do different size of signs, so we can have signs this size, which we can supply.
Sorry, Hugh. It's not the size of the signs. The signs where I'm thinking of are large signs, yes. And the picture's reasonable. But then there's loads and loads of writing, and it's not clear. I mean, I've not got the best eyesight in the world, and it's really not good for me.
I take that on board. I think the pertinent point. Most pertinent point for me is the fouling on a play area. My son plays a lot of rugby. There is absolutely nothing worse than the son or daughter rolling around in dog mess. So how would we look to tackle that? What we would say is if we've got any information as to the persons responsible, we'll approach those persons. And very often that's a problem where people walk these dogs undercover at night, and we just haven't got that information. How else are we trying to tackle it? We have a couple of action days a year where we try and heighten the profile of what's happening. Next Thursday, so we've got an action day throughout Monmouthshire with the town and community councils who participate. It's focusing in Monmouth, but all the other 18 town and community councils, we're looking for them to do something. And we then try and maximise profile by going to the press, having photographs in the press, and trying again to raise awareness. But it's certainly a difficult nut to crack.
Thank you, Hugh. I'm sorry we're going to have to move this discussion on because we are running out of time, and I'm sure everybody, will go along to these meetings and will get in touch with Hugh with their specific problems. So if we can move the discussion on, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Two perhaps very last quick points. Air quality, pollution we deal with. I see Val here and Paul Keeble. We've got 2 air quality management areas in the council, both in Usk, one in Usk and one in Chepstow. We work very closely in both monitoring the air quality, which is traffic related, and linking in with stakeholders to try and bring about improvements wherever possible. Throughout all the complaints that we deal with, you'll see on the very last slide, but we're around about 1,700, 1,800 complaints a year across the range of things that we deal with, from pollution, statutory nuisance complaints, environmental protection matters. And typically, as you see from 2011, 2012, it's around about 2,700, 800, 900, 1,700, 800, 900 mark that we deal with. And that is the challenge that we've got, is trying to, our officers have got to deal with that reactive work, but also portion time aside to deal with proactive elements which have got high public health risk.
Thank you very much indeed, Hugh. I just would like to let members know that Hugh did mention about the cold, and just to let everybody know that there is a new policy, a cold weather homeless policy, which will be coming to the Adult Select in the autumn. Thank you very much. If we can move on.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. In terms of licensing, in my introduction, Linda's been at this committee before, so we'll park that because I'm conscious there's a couple of other items that members want to get through this morning. So without any further ado, 5.3 is there for information. Certainly if you have got any questions, members, then certainly let me know and I'll refer them through to Linda O'Gorman. So if we can hand over to Gareth, he assures me he's going to cover trading standards in 5 minutes.
There we go, no problem. Actually, hopefully, if members are attending this afternoon's induction session, then you'll get to hear well, not a lot more, a bit more detail about it all. Just to quickly add a little bit more context from a trading standards perspective, obviously these reports started after the cuts about 3 years ago, but already in the run-up to that, we'd received a number of cuts, partly from external sources as well, unfortunately. Animal health in particular, people will remember the foot and mouth disease outbreak and subsequent outbreaks following 2001. And initially, UK government put £10 million extra into additional resources to undertake the critical control point inspections and everything. Unfortunately, as time drifts and memories become a bit more distant, that edged off, and at one point we did have 5 animal health officers in Monmouthshire. Unfortunately now we're down to 1.5. So unfortunately, yes, and at the moment we're doing a little bit of work with Welsh Government, looking at where, because it's quite clear that the critical control points where the disease control is most at risk, they're the areas that are not being policed, and of course standards slip, as we know, when things aren't being policed. So there's currently a partnership delivery work programme being undertaken with the Welsh Heads Trading Standards, and I'm the strategic lead for Wales for animal health and for feed. So that's bringing in a little bit of additional resource. But again, that's sort of balanced against income generation and in these times of austerity cuts. Feed, I wanted to mention particularly, that's an area that resources, when they did come to the authority, didn't get the front line. We weren't talking a significant amount of money. Typically for Monmouthshire, being a rural authority, we tend to get the wrong end of the stick, and I think Cardiff ended up getting the majority of the money, Powys got the smallest amount, and we were somewhere in between. So it was an area which I think Wales would have been subject to infraction proceedings had they not taken it in hand. So they took the money from the RSG, give it to the FSA to fund us direct, but that's done on a regional basis. So again, it's on the Cardiff City region, and Monmouthshire for that region has 50% of the animal health and feed establishments. So again, it's a significant element for us. But what it has shown in the first 2 years across Wales, that 97% last year and 100% the first year of funds reached where they needed to, and those inspections were undertaken. And of course, the whole aspect of feed and animal health really sort of supports, as Dave was mentioning earlier, the farm to fork position, and all the good work of our colleagues in environmental health would be undermined if we didn't have that good starting block and the support of the farming community that's really required. Fair trading, again, a vast area. I've put in there the successes for last year. We've mentioned Celtic Letting's prosecution. It was unfortunate that money, that fraud that took place, was to fund a lifestyle which couldn't be afforded. And as a result, we did do a POCA process, but because there isn't any money there, there's no assets, there's no resources in the background, all the court could do was put an order against Neil Bradbury to say, right, in the future, if he does come into any money of any sort, then the Proceeds of Crime Act will kick in, and then hopefully there'll be something back, and hopefully we could then go back and give some compensation to those residents who lost out. Another ongoing one is the European mini market in Welsh Street. We had a rather large seizure back last year, successful prosecution. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to have put the offenders off. It's not something we normally tend to have in Monmouthshire, fortunately, and they seem to have come across from Gloucester who have had particular problems. But I think what is shown, it's the networks out there, it's all part of organised crime. There's links back up to the Midlands and to the southwest, and it's a much bigger regional, national picture that we are just sort of feeding into and touching the top of the iceberg on. Consumer protection, I think the biggest issue I'd want to mention there, and again, I'll go into more detail this afternoon, is the vulnerable people work. It's scams. More and more people are aware of scams. They come in all sort of forms, whether it's email, post, phone calls, linked to road traders. Again, that often goes back to organised crime as well. So again, there's a lot of work going there, and I'd be happy to go into more detail with people individually. Weights and measures, often the forgotten thing. It's where trading standards stemmed from originally, metrology, inspectors of weights and measures. What we've been doing recently is linking into medical equipment. So I think it's obviously it's key. At the end of the day, if hospitals are using scales that determine people's medication, often it's vital life support, then the accuracy of those machines is key. So we've done a bit of work on that. I think nationally it's flagged up a larger problem. And as you mentioned there, air quality, we've even linked in with that. So we undertake the Lorry Watch scheme on behalf of highways, again sort of trying to lend a hand with the problems in Usk. What it has shown is that actually 90% of the lorries, the vehicles, are there for legitimate reason, but often that doesn't help the individuals. I won't go into any more detail.
Thank you very much indeed.
Shall I just conclude, Madam Chair?
Yes, please, thank you.
Just very quickly, because I appreciate members got other items to cover. In terms of 5.5, that's just to say, I think it's Councillor Smith's point really, it is about linking up better, isn't it? So Steddfod was a very good example, I think, of not just environmental health training standards and licensing working together. People focus on the mice, but we spent an awful time at Mice B in terms of noise, and Hugh was out and about with his noise meter, Paul Dab again. But also the big campsites. So we do check for safety in terms of caravan and camping and barbecues and carbon monoxide poisoning. The water supply is key, isn't it? So just quickly with that one, there's over 100 hours of public protection effort went into that, working with traffic management and all the rest of it. So there's a significant chunk of work that goes to support successful events in the county. I covered what does that mean in terms of overall performance last year in the current report, so I won't touch on that again, Chair. And just the future talks about, yes, we are going along, we are focusing, I think Gareth picked up this whole issue about vulnerable people. The sales pitches, we have got it just happens to be on the same day, but for members who are around at 2 o'clock this afternoon, we have got the induction session that covers these topics in more detail this afternoon. But in terms of future priorities, income, clearly, we are tapping that resource as best we can. If people can pay for stuff, we'll certainly get them to do so. And the whole issue, 7.3, I think it's picked up by Councillor Jones, was this issue about working better with community councils. We can't do everything. Limited resource. Another example would be block consent, so I won't go into the detail of that, but it's about, Christmas fairs in Usk, etc. We're handing the onus on to the community councils to deliver those rather than the local authority. A big one will be new legislation comes in, and obviously as an authority we are, resources are tight. I think we made that point this morning. Public health bill is coming our way, so we have asked for resources to ensure that is covered when that comes in to fruition later this year, hopefully. For next year, we'll go through the due process. So I think that's it. I think 7.6 is the final bit about protecting vulnerable people, reducing antisocial behaviour. I think we spoke about vehicles, enviro crimes, etc. The the farm to fork elements, the feedstuffs that Gareth spoke to, and I think generally I think it is vast, so we'll certainly welcome members' views on how we sort of narrow that down for future committees.
Thank you very much indeed, David. And on behalf, unless there's any other questions, on behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank you for such a comprehensive report this morning. And I think that we need to ask ourselves moving forward, are members happy that we continue to discuss this? It's such a massive subject, and I'm very mindful that really we haven't been able to give it the justice it deserves, because it's such a critical area and keeping everybody safe in our county. Would anybody like to make any comments on how much we've tried to cover, and whether in the future we should go ahead doing that, or whether we should concentrate on specific aspects? Any comments? Councillor Smith.
I think our officers cover a huge workload. I always find the reports very interesting. It is time out of their work, making their presentations for us, that I don't know how they feel. You're making 2 presentations to it, or coming to us twice a year. I don't know if you can make better use of your time. I've been around a little while, so I know a little bit more about the breadth and the scope, and I do appreciate the pressures you're working under, and any time away from the job is difficult. There is just one question, Chairman, if I may. There was a reference in the report to construction and related to the A465 as to whether we were able to recoup any costs from the contractors carrying out that work. Just something for noting, please.
Thank you.
Just very quickly on that, Chair, I've spoken to my colleague in Newport, so apologies, I know you raised it previously. Spoken to Hugh, we will draft a letter on behalf of councillors plus officers to try and get it linked, what it is, about the M4 Relief Road, sorry, sort of looping ahead. There's no cash resource back to us, so you're dealing with major developers. Was it £1 billion scheme, I think? So Hugh, I think, and Mike Richardson probably spent 30 hours plus on it already. So Councillor Smith made the point about, can we recoup some of that money? So certainly we're liaising with Newport and Cardiff in that regard, and we'll be drafting something in that respect.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I think before we move on to the next item, I'd just like to ask everybody to think very carefully between now and our next meeting about how we move forward. The next report is due to come in December, and I think we need to really question how we make the most effective use both of the officers' time and our own time in these meetings. But thank you very much indeed for the report this morning.
Obviously pass on your thanks to the frontline officers. Thank you.
Thank you. So we now move on to our next item, which is the curb craft. Our officers, if you'd like to come forward. Are there any declarations of interest from anybody at all? Thank you. Thank you very much. So moving on to Curbcraft, if I could invite Mr. Hoggins to introduce the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. In March of this year, the Council received the Wales Audit Office report and debated the findings of that report, and they agreed an action plan which was attached to that report. This is an update on that action plan prior to that being submitted to Cabinet in July, again in line with what was included within the action plan. There are various appendices attached to the report. And they outline the new policies and procedures which we are recommending to Cabinet be adopted. There's few items which I particularly bring to members' attention. In the action plan, officers were required to review the existing processes for undertaking Curbcraft training. That's been done, and that's now been included within these policies and procedures being presented. One of the major weaknesses within the Curbcraft process highlighted by Wales Audit Office in particular was safeguarding in relation to the use of volunteers. Traditionally, volunteers have been recruited through individual schools, and so we've used individual volunteers in individual schools, approved by the school and checks undertaken which were recorded with each school. However, that was an area where there's considered to be a weakness within the processes which we undertook. So in reviewing these procedures, officers are now recommended that we reduce the number of volunteers being used to a figure which would at any point in time would be no more than 6. In doing so, that offers us a much reduced administrative burden, but nevertheless allows us to continue to provide the training required by Welsh Government under the Curbcraft process. Obviously, we're reducing from records for up to 80 volunteers down to 6. But that will be moving on. It will be updated as it goes along. That, we believe, offers us a great deal more assurance in that the potential issue around safeguarding and the use of volunteers. Obviously, where it's paid staff, those are all checked. And we do not have that problem, but this is a particular area which was highlighted as a risk within the existing Curbcraft process, so that has been addressed. I won't go through each individual aspect of the action plan. It is provided to members as appendix, I believe it's appendix 1 to the report. I would highlight that today we are reporting this to yourselves for your consideration and any comments which you would wish to make, and then pass on to Cabinet. One area within the action plan which is notated with updates on various aspects, which doesn't include the update, is the relation to performance measures. Presently we use performance measures for Welsh Government, and those are reported quarterly. Recommendation of this is that we actually report to one of our committees as well, so that will be included. But the reporting is relatively straightforward. It is around number of children and number of schools where training has been undertaken. But we do intend to enhance that and get feedback from parents about whether or not they feel about the quality of the training being delivered. So we will be enhancing that. It also requires that we consider which committee this is reported to in the future. This report is coming to Strong Communities as the Curbcraft has been part of the road safety grant coming from Welsh Government, which has traditionally been part of highways. However, in the future, the Curbcraft being explicit to schools will be reported through to Children and Young People's Committee and managed through that process. So that's where we're going to go in the future. At that stage, Madam Chairman, I'll take questions as members see fit.
Thank you. First of all, can we Councillor Eason?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Roger. This matter was discussed. We took the presentation from the Audit Office of Wales, a strong meeting of Council 2 months ago. If you go to key issues 3.3, one of the actions requires the preparation and implementation of new procedures, etc., before it's reported to the Cabinet. Surely this report should go to full council, as full council took it on the chin in March, or when it was when this report was put before council. Should it surely go back to council now for further consideration rather than Cabinet alone?
Madam Chairman, what we've replicated here is what was agreed at Council. If that is feedback from this committee that they believe this should be fed back to Council, then that can be reported to Cabinet when I report in July. Obviously, that I need to take the view of your committee.
Thank you. If I can just explain that really what we're asking members today, the scrutiny is about this action plan, and are we all happy that this plan as it stands goes forward to Cabinet, and does it meet the challenges? It is going to children and young people, as Roger has explained, which is in fact a meeting next week, and in the future it's likely to sit with the children and young people, but we really need to say today whether we're happy with the report as it stands. Councillor Guppy.
Yes, thank you for the report. It's quite nice that it's only been a couple of months since it's been reported to full council, and it's been brought here now with the election in between, that actions are being taken seriously and progress being moved fast. I think it's quite apparent with all the procedures, the extra procedures being put in, that this will be a policy that will improve our standards and protection of children, which I think that was the main sort of criticism, really. At full council, we was told that there was a suspension of the service, and now it's been gradually introduced. Is there any feedback at the current timing of how much we're progressing in view of delivering since there's been a halt?
Thank you. Roger?
The scheme in itself wasn't actually suspended. What was suspended was the use of volunteers. We continued with the scheme using paid staff. We have one full-time employee and 2 part-time employees. They continued to provide the scheme, albeit we had to reduce the number of schools which we could service and the extent of the scheme to some degree. Nevertheless, it was provided, and Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think all schools in this academic year will have received the training, albeit on a reduced basis. By reintroducing volunteers under a much more controlled process rather than each individual school, then it offers us the opportunity to restore that level of training. I think previously the training would have been done over 12 weeks. I think the proposal now is it'd be done over 10. So by doing that, we can still offer it, but it was never actually suspended in its entirety. Sorry, that's not true. It was suspended temporarily, but in order that we continue, we said, let's continue with our staff because we know what we're dealing with our staff. So that was how we dealt with it.
Thank you. And just to say that locally and feedback from residents and parents that it is a good scheme and it needs definitely to be continued. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to draw, obviously, everybody's attention to page 34, where we have the action plan, and it sets out quite clearly what has happened and what is planned. And we just really, I'd just like to ask everybody, is everybody happy that this report? Councillor Davis.
Thank you, Chair. Excuse me. Roger, one element of the report or the audit office concern was the fact that they felt their perception was that they had been misled. Obviously, that's not contained within this report, which I got no issue with at all. But from the committee's point of view, can we be satisfied that that element has been investigated and any actions needed have been taken? Thank you.
Members will understand if I don't discuss this in any level of detail at this moment in time, but I can confirm an investigation has been undertaken and is not completed, but has been undertaken, and we continue to correspond with Wales Audit Office on the matter.
Councillor Brown.
Yes, obviously I don't know the background with regard to the Wales audit report, and it is obviously vitally important when you're dealing with children to ensure that all people have had proper safeguarding training, which I do consider is important. But I'm a little bit concerned about the implication of the report for actual delivery on the ground in terms of Curbcraft. You mentioned that these schools currently have all had some Curbcraft training. And I want to know whether or not the staff that are available here are going to be the same, and that there is a significant reduction there. If you're talking about, you mentioned 6 volunteers, and I think there were 80 before. So I think that in terms of service provision, I think that particular aspect needs to have some feedback on. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger.
Yeah. The number of staff, the number of paid employees of Monmouthshire County Council remain the same. As you quite rightly point out, it's a change in the number of volunteers. Previously, when we had, it was up to 80 volunteers, they would work at individual schools. So for that particular school, we would have a group of volunteers, which may come from parents, quite typically came from parents and grandparents, in order to work with our staff to undertake that training. So you had a range. There was, I don't know, would it be 3 or 4 perhaps volunteers to work with our people to undertake this training for those children. We are now going to reduce it to 6. However, they will move from one school to the other. So the actual number of people on the ground providing the training will be the same. It's just we won't have them for each individual school. We'll have a group which we keep updated and use those between schools rather than working with each individual school. Nevertheless, each individual school will be asked to approve what we have in place and what arrangements we have in place. That has always happened. However, this process, and by detailing it in this level and with a checklist, brings more assurance to that process is actually undertaken.
Thank you very much. So moving forward, unless there's any other questions, what will be happening, obviously this is going also to children and young people, and it will be looked at, there's going to be an internal audit, and an action plan will be looked at again in January 2018. There will obviously need to be a follow-up by children and young people following that. So unless there's any further questions.
If I may, Madam Chairman, one point I would like to make or re-emphasise is this scheme's undertaken on behalf of Welsh Government. And they provide a grant for us to undertake this, and we are meeting with Welsh Government, I believe it's next week, to discuss the process which we have in place, because obviously this is provided across all 22 authorities within Wales. So we are providing feedback to them as well on this matter. And on how we intend to proceed in the future.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for your comments. And I think, nothing can be more important than the safety of our young children. So I think it's been great that we've been able to have a really close look at this today. Thank you very much indeed. Right, so now we're going to move on to revenue and capital monitoring, 2016-2017. Mark. And I'd like to introduce Mark, and if you could please present your report to members. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you that are new members as part of this administration, this is a fairly standardised report in terms of a pro forma that basically gives members a general understanding of the financial position of the council, because you all represent your wards, but then also goes into more specific details about that part of the portfolio that's been attributed to stronger communities. So, starting the general remit of the select group will be to look at paragraph 1.2 to assess whether effective budget monitoring takes place. Effectively, it's judging the roles of senior leadership team and Cabinet. With regard to the outturn report, obviously some of it is known now, so the challenging of reasonableness of projected overspends and underspends, well, those aren't forecast anymore, those are a matter of public record. But obviously if you look at paragraph 3.15, you can actually have a look at the trend of an improving position through the year and may want to ask some questions about that. You'll also be able to assess the extent of budgets that are spent in accordance with agreed budget and policy frameworks. And importantly, what you do as members every year, every January, set a degree of savings that's required of the council to meet a declining public sector resource. And there is a part of this report that actually assesses the progress through the year against those particular schemes or projects. So in terms of revenue, the important table there is paragraph 3.12, which indicates an £884,000 underspend. It sounds like a lot, but against the £143 million budget, it's probably a variance of less than 0.005%. So actually an £800,000 deficit would still have been a good result in terms of getting that close. But what it does mean, it allows for a certain replenishment of reserves, and you can see in recommendation 2.5 what that recommendation is. It effectively means that we will add £570,000 to the priority investment reserve, top up the redundancy and pension reserve by £114,000, add to the IT transformation reserve by £100,000, and similarly with the capital receipts reserve. There are far more reserves than that. So those are obviously just the reserves that exhibit a volatility through the year. And it's probably important to note when we get down to reserves that despite topping up the priority investment fund by 570,000, by the end of 2017-18, that reserve is likely to expire in full. So if we move on to paragraph 3.19, which is the strong communities context in relation to revenue, and you can see there the more notable over and underspends that you might want to ask questions on later. The other element of Strong Communities remit, looking at the savings progress, starts at 3.2.5 and details the savings that are part of the Chief Exec's operations and corporate savings and the progress made by the end of the financial year to achieve them. The report also covers off the capital position for the whole council, but importantly in 3.3.1 it identifies the consequences to the Stronger Communities capital programme, which indicates £1.1 million worth of slippage and £830,000 underspend. I'm clear in the report that obviously there's a need every year to actually have a look at the slippage, make sure that the programme and the priority for the council is still valid and current. And obviously what I will do is recommend to Cabinet those schemes whereby sufficient progress has been made or have been unduly delayed that will slip into the next year where there is not the evidence of a particular scheme or a particular item. It doesn't form the definition of slippage and therefore would instead be part of an underspend. And that may go to your question later on, Councillor.
I am not laughing at the answer. I'm laughing at my comments here, which I've got at the top here, explain calcs and various other things going through. Right.
So in terms of slippage, there is 51,000 recommended in relation to Hubs development of Abergavenny, 85,000 in relation to fixed asset disposals, 152,000 in relation to the Granville Road car park scheme, 344 in relation to highway schemes, 23 in relation to IT schemes, and just under £350,000 in section 106. So you can kind of see the volatility that goes on capital-wise, which is why it's important at the end of the year that we actually look to assess whether that is really slippage or an underspend. Because what happens is if it's slippage, it then forms a volatility on the revenue account next year in affording the Treasury consequences to it. The underspends, conversely, i.e. the slippage that hasn't been accepted, are around improvement works to Caldecott Castle Kitchen, County Farms disposals, IT schemes of 15,000, a budget for low-cost home ownership, farms maintenance budget 45,000, 177 in relation to section 106 and 376 in relation to highways and 91 in relation to property. That money isn't immediately available for members to actually passport on to other schemes. Much of it will be a mixture of section 106 or reserve funding expenditure in relation to the IT fund, and those resources go back to those various pots for reallocation and bringing back to members as part of their consideration of future capital programmes. So it's not lost to you, it's just not immediately passported through into the following financial year. Table 3.3.13 is a very useful reminder to all members. It identifies the extent of capital receipts that we've had in and are due to have in. The importance for that is that our biggest single capital scheme is to do with the replacement of 2 secondary schools in Caldecott and Monmouth, which requires just over £30 million worth of receipts to help afford it. We don't have £30 million in the receipt in the bank today. We don't need £30 million in the bank today, but we do need to keep a weather eye on those receipts coming in as the expenditure progresses. In the first instance, we're actually using Welsh Government's share of the resourcing, so but it's worthwhile keeping on people's agenda. So then the third part of the report around the reserves, 3.4 indicates the general council fund position, which is effectively the same as last year because we've actually used the underspend or the surplus to replenish earmarked reserve rather than top up council fund. Schools balances does show a decline on the year. We had hoped that through the year that the EAS and Welsh Government stance previously in giving us ad hoc money towards the end of the year for improvement works would carry on. That hasn't materialised, which means actually the balance at the end of the year is £260,000. Annually, schools make a draw on their reserves of the order of about between 800 and £1 million, so clearly it won't sustain that level of funding into this next year. Senior colleagues and members are considering their response to that. We have recently had in the schools section 52 budgets, and you may appreciate that schools are a little different than the rest of the council in that they have statutory budgetary requirements. That means they're outside of our normal timetable, so we don't actually get to know what the budget for a school for September will be until the end of May. So we're actually looking at the consequences of that to be able to provide some recommendations to senior management. Yeah, and probably at that point I'm happy to take any questions that you have there. What I would say is that if you want to know any of the details, I'm always happy to have a conversation with you separately, and there is a hyperlink in there that attaches you to all the background papers, both revenue, reserves and capital, if you wish to look at it.
Thank you, Mark, for giving us that overview. I know that Councillor Val Smith has some questions she'd like to ask under 2.5.
Can I have a tutorial again, please? Right. In your report, it's going to be the question that I ask each time, sort of looking at the revenue position. The original budget that was put forward, we don't see that. We did on one report, I can remember, that actually showed what we had said at the beginning of that year, 2015 or whatever it was. This will be the budget for X, Y, Z, whatever. Because I find I cannot make any accurate comparison. I am absolutely confident that any environments and adjustments are properly and accurately, honestly done. But I, as an elected member, would still want to know what the original budget that was set in April 2016 was for these items running down. Only in that way can I determine whether somebody is operating well or not. Or I want to know the reason why somebody is spending more and more money is being wired in. So I do regret that that is not indicated, Chairman. And I have got a lot of questions going through the report, and very seriously, I would appreciate a session with yourself to talk through, because I have got these things, is slippage taken into the calculations, is this, that and the other, what's this, and I found it very useful last time.
Thank you. If you'd like to reply.
Yeah. What we try to do is provide a report that's incremental in nature through the year. So you'll appreciate that the starting budget agreed in the January isn't necessarily the same budget as the end of the year. And what we've tried to do is every year we provide the budget in the previous report and any adjustments that have gone on. Thinking about it, if members aren't that mindful about the level of budget variance and revisions made during that particular period, because I've only got so many columns that I can actually put in the report before it becomes illegible and too small for people to read it, I might instead actually take up the mantle of that and actually have a initial budget at the start of the year and the revised budget, and not actually include the extent of the variance, if that would be a sensible suggestion to take it forward.
I certainly would appreciate it, because this is the final report now for the finances, how we've actually operated as a council in the last 12 months. And I think that other members might find that a very interesting figure to look at. For example, okay, let's just look at the adult services, what the actual allocation was, the budget at the beginning of the year, and what it is at the end of the year. Appreciating that there will be adjustments, there will be variants and whatever going throughout. I would find it very, very useful, plus an explanation of lots of other things in there.
Yeah, what I would say to you on things like social care budgets and those service budgets, there isn't that much volatility in the year. What you'll find is the volatility is in the darker arts of accountancy around things like the treasury budgets and the use of reserves, which obviously will be a movable feast because members will agree that through the year.
Thank you very much. What we've been asked is to members to make any comments on areas that they are concerned about. So has anybody else got, if I could ask Councillor Anne Webb.
Thank you, Chairman. Are you able to enlighten us a little bit more on the county farms disposal, or is this not appropriate here? Thank you very much.
It was just that last year there was a part of the disposals policy was to bring a farm forward. It actually slipped into this year rather than last year, so that budget formed part of an underspend because there is actually a standard disposals budget. Is that the nature of the question? Yeah. Yeah.
Are you happy with that reply? Yeah. Councillor Smith.
Go. I feel it's regrettable that there's been a low take-up of the occupational pension schemes by staff. I know we benefit, if you can say, financially, but I do feel it's a short view by those members of staff. And you're looking at the absence figures as well, that's good.
I can't recall where that actually is in the report, but I agree with you in relation to. I think it's in relation to operational services staff and generally the waste teams. Yeah.
On page 69,
what we historically do, you'll appreciate that the way that a local authority pension works is that the council provides part of it and the individual provides their part of it in terms of providing for their pension. We do historically make the presumption that we will budget for our part of it. And we do work with staff to encourage them to take out a pension for their old age. We can't insist that they do so. And obviously, if they don't make their contributions, then effectively the council won't make its contribution. So there is an underspend that results as a consequence, but there is a lot of work being done by HR, payroll, and managers of those services to encourage particular staff that don't take out a pension to do so. You'll appreciate that there's a general publication scheme across the national press and the television that encourages everyone to take out a pension where possible.
Thank you very much, Councillor Smith, and thank you for the replies. Are there any other questions you'd like to ask?
Chairman, there is so much within this report. Why have transfers of assets not occurred? Have we not got enough staff to carry out those actions? Why are we spending more? Why is there an overspend with the Borough Theatre? I thought that was a transferred action. So there is a huge quantity to be questions, and it's not fair on the rest of the committee. They've got their questions.
I would totally agree with you, and as a new member I must admit it did actually take me 3 hours to read these reports, and you know you are just scratching the surface. So I think all we're asking from members today is that we highlight any concerns that we have, and that they're noted. So is there anything else anybody would like to add on the bigger picture? Any other questions from any other members? Councillor Roden, I know you've got a business background. Are there any questions you'd like to ask?
Not at present, Chair.
Councillor Smith.
Yeah, there is one thing that members are aware of. The issue of slippage, that officers must really, really appreciate that it is not a good policy to ask for 100,000 to do a scheme that might come. Those schemes need to be prepared and ready on the board and actual, not just wish lists, because that corrupts the figures so far as I'm concerned. You've got an officer asking for slippage on a scheme that they haven't really properly prepared, they're not ready for, and if the money was suddenly there they couldn't execute. And then we've got this tremendous amount, what is it, something like 40% slippage, isn't it, within our budget? And that is something that officers need to be well aware that they've got to be better prepared and plan and put forward structured schemes, says me.
Thank you. For the benefit of new members, I wonder if you could just explain exactly about slippage. Thank you.
Slippage is a term we apply to the capital programme. What members will do in setting a capital programme is decide on the priorities for the forthcoming year of a capital nature. Those of you that attended the finance training recently will understand the difference between revenue and capital, that capital is to do with fixed assets, extending its useful life, its value, etc. So generally the more significant amount of funding rather than the revenue funding, which tends to be the day-to-day funding for services particular. Capital seems to be more about projects. So in relation to slippage, it's odd for an accountant to say this, but the financial year to a certain extent is an artificial construct. It would be great if we could actually get things started in April and finished by March. So there's a degree of works that will generally go on that may very well extend across that financial year. If there is evidence of that work going on and the budget has been agreed by members, there will be an acceptance of a slippage that actually the unspent portion of that budget will transfer into the new financial year. When we spoke earlier about the consideration of generic budgets not transferring through, if that officer had identified that he was actually proposing to do any particular work, that work had actually started, rather than simply it being a case of that he was just willing to roll over a resource into the year, that probably would have been accepted. But we take more of a zealous view around slippage increasingly, because the effect of it is felt in the Treasury budget that is used predominantly to offset the pressures in the net cost of services. So you'll know that there's about £900,000 net cost of services deficit. We only achieved an £800,000 surplus on the basis of Treasury savings and council tax receipts.
Thank you very much indeed for covering that point. Councillor Eason.
Thank you again, Chair. Roger, if you look at the waste and street scene, you're showing a surplus of £250,000 or thereabouts. Yet overall, there's a net underspend within the portfolio that comes to us. The waste and street scene surplus, is that coming from, or can you explain where that's coming from? Because you've changed some issues regarding brown bag sales and things like that. Where do you get a surplus from, and how can it be constructed in the future, or will it be there in the future? And the mic's working well now, we'll look at it.
if you could point me to the reference, I'd have a cracking go at giving you an answer. I suspect there are some aspects to it. One would be in relation to. One is in relation to take up on pensions. I believe the other is in relation to how the Project Gwyth payment is structured. We are effectively getting an overpayment at this time from Welsh Government. It will balance itself out over the years in which we get the payments from Welsh Government. Those are two of the major areas where the underspend is occurring within that area. Just back to the pension issue, we do highlight to staff the prudence in taking out the local authority pension. Nevertheless, it's a balance which they take against their day-to-day living costs, and unfortunately it does, at this point in time at least, provide us with an underspend because of how we budget for it. There are many other aspects within, where is it in there? It's just the Waston Street scene. Yeah, those are the predominant areas within the Waston Street scene which have seen the variation in this year.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions at all for Mark? I would just like to add that one concern that I have is the number of schools, 12, being in deficit. And there is also a comment here that obviously flexibility is now pretty much exhausted with all the pressures that are on schools to deliver a new curriculum, etc. Are we confident that there will be the resources available to ensure that we continue to see our standards increasing in Monmouth? Thank you.
I probably echo your concern, which is why I probably wrote the comment. I mean, we're now getting to the stage where a third of our schools are experiencing a deficit. It will be probably more of a focus for CYP Select to look at in this administration than it ever has been in the past administration. And I think we've got the problem across the piece there in terms of how we take of the order of £5 million out of our services a year without it necessarily affecting standards and services across the piece, whether it be schools or otherwise.
Thank you very much. So are there any members that would like to raise any other points that we can feed back to Cabinet about any concerns that you may have with this financial report? Councillor.
My initial grumble about the removal of slippage towards those three elements at the end, one of which was fire, asbestos, and I appreciate that it falls into another section within the authority, but I just don't think it's a very good idea.
Thank you very much, and that has been noted and will be fed back. Yes, Roger.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And Property Services and Mum falls within the Operations Directorate. Even though they may have reduced in those budget areas, it's still a requirement upon those officers to ensure that we provide safe places to work. So whilst they may have reduced in those particular budget areas, I know radon gas as well, asbestos is another, there is still a requirement to comply with legislation in relation to those areas. So it is then a case of reprioritising accordingly.
I'm not sure what the regulation is regarding the fire, but I will check up.
Yeah, could I just remind members that property services are a bit unique in their administration of their part of the capital programme. Annually, the property services manager gets 1.9 million to allocate to specific schemes that he feels is a priority. So, unlike other members of staff that will get a specific project to deliver, the fact that there is an underspend, i.e. that they didn't do any work on asbestos removal, etc. within the year, it's because there are no unidentified problems. There is nothing stopping the property services manager allocating part of that 1.9 million in the next financial year to asbestos removal, radon detection or whatever. It's more of a recurring pot than a lot of other capital or expenditure items, if that reassures you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from members? So we thank you very much for the report today, and we have obviously carefully noted members' comments, and they will be fed to the Cabinet for further consideration. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, thank you. I'm moving on to the last 3 items. I'm advised by Hazel that we usually deal with these en bloc. So point number 10 is the action list, 11, the Strong Communities Forward Work Programme, and the Cabinet and Council Forward Work Programme. Obviously, as I previously mentioned, we are going to consider at the next meeting our future programme. But if we can take the action list first of all.
Yeah. The action list, Chair, just ensures that actions that arise from the minutes here today will be dealt with. It helps officers because obviously the minutes can be quite lengthy, so it's a short, sharp reminder of things that need to be followed up after the meeting. In terms of the Scrutiny Forward Work Programme, I would propose to you that at your next meeting perhaps we have a work programme discussion where we can take some of your suggestions forward to prioritise for scrutiny for the rest of the year. If it's agreeable to you, I'm happy to prepare a work programme report and to highlight some of the issues that this committee has scrutinised in the past and some suggestions that officers have given me for future topics that will require scrutiny, and then you can have a conversation and decide where you'd like to prioritise your time, maybe some aspects of work that you'd like to do outside of the committee. In terms of the Cabinet Forward Planner, that is usually a useful starting point in order to sort of prioritise some things that you might want to scrutinise. I think you'll appreciate that we're just starting the sort of new council year, it is a little bit sparse today, so I don't suggest that we go through it unless you particularly wish to do so. There is one item in there that would fall within this committee's remit and has been scrutinised previously, and that is a forthcoming contaminated land inspection strategy. So I'd take members' views now as to whether you'd like to look at that or not. For your next meeting, we've had a request to bring you a performance report on all services within this committee's remit, and I would suggest that's a useful starting point for you as well to lead into a discussion around the work programme. It tends to focus the mind on areas that might require scrutiny and might need to be prioritised. So that would be the plan for your next meeting unless anything urgent comes on top of that. But we tend to sort of limit each agenda to about 3 items, and I think it would be worth having an actual sort of time for discussion on the work programme rather than us just sort of adding it on to the end of each meeting and doing a sort of rolling plan. I think you need to think carefully about how you can prioritise your time and your capacity, because I'm aware that some of you are on multiple selects this time, and that really does sort of focus the mind.
Thank you very much for that, Hazel, and for clarifying the position. Councillor Eason.
Yeah, thank you again, Chair. We've got the action list. I presume we're getting some feedback on those points before the end of the meeting. And the second question is, we've got a subcommittee, as you're aware, of a speeding subcommittee. There's been no reference to that in our forward work. Where are we going with that, please, Chair, or Hazel?
Yeah, I'll ask Hazel to comment on that.
We did actually discuss this in the pre-meeting, but I'm not sure if you were here, Councillor Eason, but we were going to mention it now under the work programme. We do have a road safety task and finish group, which is primarily looking at developing a sort of speed management policy for Monmouthshire. It's a multi-agency task group with Go Safe and the police on that group. and a fire representative is invited to those meetings. But in view of new members, I'm wondering whether some new members might feel that they've got some experience to add, or they'd like to take part in that group. I met with the chair recently, the chair of that task group, which is the former Strong Communities chair and also the new chair of this select committee, and we agreed that it might be best that the task group remains chaired by the previous chair to ensure some continuity, but the new chair would like to take part on that task group too, and we could move to an arrangement where they switch chairing and alternate at meetings. But I think we need to keep the task group quite focused, because we're certainly some way through our work, but there is still an opportunity for new members to join. But I think we need to be careful about numbers, so please, if you'd like to be on that and you've got the time to allocate, then that's great, but don't take on too much would be my advice. If there's any indication now of people who are interested in joining that task group, I'd like to know now, because I'm planning on setting up the next meeting.
Councillor Davis, and then Councillor Jones, and then Councillor Brown. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'd like to be on that committee because during my canvassing for the local elections, one of the main concerns that I heard on the doorstep was speeding, particularly within 20-mile-an-hour zones. And I've already spoken to the police representative about that, and I think, yeah, I'd like to sit on that committee because it is a major concern for the public, I think.
Thank you. Councillor Jones?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I think speeding is probably one of the biggest things in Wisham as well that people are concerned about. Therefore, I would really like to be on that. Thank you.
Councillor Brown, and then Councillor Roden.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I'll be very interested in this particular aspect, because obviously speeding is a major issue in my ward, but also in the whole of the authority. And I have had previous highways experience, which I think would be very useful, plus experience in connection with the police. Thank you.
Councillor Roden?
Speeding is definitely an issue in Monmouth, and I have issues regarding Hereford Road, the Buckhold, so I'd be very interested in joining the committee if that's possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And as Hazel has said, thank you.
I would also like to be added to that as well, please. This is a big problem in the Elms.
Thank you very much, Councillor Dimmock.
Just to sort of give you a flavour, we've already got at least 7 members on that task and finish group. Usually we keep it to a smaller number. I'm not saying that new members can't join if they're interested, but please bear in mind that this task group is looking at speed management across the whole of the county. It won't be looking at individual cases. It won't be a case of turning up with a specific ward-related issue and discussing that in depth. This is about looking at a policy that's suitable for Monmouthshire as a whole. So if you still want to take part, then I've got Councillor Roden, Councillor Jones, Councillor Dimmock, Councillor Brown and Councillor Davis. Are you all still happy to be on that group, bearing in mind it's a county-wide strategic policy? Yeah? Okay.
So are there any other questions from members on the last 3 points on the agenda today? What did you? Yes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mark and myself have got an update on the action plan, action points item. What item are they? 10 on your agenda. That being figures in relation to Raglan Cattle Market. I can confirm that the authority has received a payment of £234,000 as an interim payment in relation to lease on the Raglan Cattle Market. I emphasise interim because a final lease has not been agreed. Until such time as we've got full confidence and assurance in the capacity of the effluent management system on the site, we know the auctioneers will be in a position to enter into the final lease agreement. That being said, we are now nearing that position and it's quite likely we'll be able to close that off in the next, I hesitate to give a period, but we are much further forward than we were. We have got a system in place which is now proven to be effective. There may be some further minor amendments to it, but as and when that's done, and we have some confidence in the cost of management and ongoing maintenance costs of it, which would be reflected in the lease, and then we'll be able to arrive at that final lease with the current auctioneers.
Thank you very much on clarifying the position there. I think if we move on to the other items from that meeting, which were concerning street lighting. For members carrying on through, they'll be aware that we had several hundred street lights on, which were on 24 hours a day. It was all to do with the control gear and new LED lighting which we'd installed. It didn't actually cost us any more money because of the way we're built. Nevertheless, it just didn't look good. The manufacturers worked with us. They provided us with new control gear, which they've installed free of charge. We're now down to, we believe, less than 50 day burners. He says, touch in wood, because you'll always find another one. There always is. But we are down to less than 50. They continue to provide us with new control gear for those lights. So that problem is finally coming to a conclusion. If I may, I'll move on to the next item, which is in relation to guarantee periods around bulbs. The background to which was, if they've been burning all this time, they're going to burn out quicker. Actually, in the industry, they don't think that's the case. It's switching them on and off, which actually causes more. But we won't get into too much detail surrounding that. The existing guarantee on the original supply of LED lamps, well, that's the 24-watt lamps. That was 5 years guarantee. The latest ones, which are, I believe, the first ones were 28 watts. The nuns are now 14 watts, and they've got a 10-year guarantee on them. Thank you very much.
Can I just ask a question? Roger, you were saying that because in the Ward of Roggett there's definitely a problem with the lights, they're still on in the day, but there also seems to be a problem as well with the repair of the lights. Roger Joy's doing a fantastic job, but I know it's self-contracted, but it doesn't seem to be happening. I'm not quite sure if that contract needs to be looked at, because the 3 or 5 working days to repair it, it's not happening.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If we've got a problem in relation to that, then I'll feed that back to Roger and see what's happening there. If it is in relation to the 24-hour burners and the LEDs, that's been going on for months and months and months. So if that is the issue, the underlying issue, then if Roggett hasn't been done, it's one of the few outstanding. We will get there to do that, so that should be in place. Once we got that in place, then we should be hitting our 5-day response. But I'll feed back to Roger on that.
In relation to the Borough Theatre, for those new members, the Borough Theatre is actually a trust arrangement we have. We outsourced our Borough Theatre to a management team that would run it for us, and we paid them an annual fee of the order of £160,000 a year to run it on our behalf. The reason why it appeared on the action list is that there were other costs that were identified to the Borough Theatre in terms of things like overtime for the market staff opening up, because it's very integral to the market hall there. And members wanted an understanding of our full extent of our commitment to it. That overtime is in the order of about £50,000 a year, so I think you can loosely regard or simplistically regard the cost of the Borough Theatre to us of the order of £210,000 a year. In terms of an update on the financial position, I'm aware that there's some conversations going on between senior politicians, senior officers and the management group in terms of the continued viability of that concern. And I understand it's being part of the proposal that's going to be brought back before all members as part of their consideration of the alternate delivery model for leisure that you will receive in September. So I haven't got any updated figures because the situation is quite volatile depending on which way the council decides to go with it.
Thank you very much indeed for that update, and that covers all of the matters that were arising from the meeting on the 6th of April. So I think
there's only one more issue for members to consider today, and this has been raised and agended for every select committee, and that's to discuss the future timing of your meetings. Economy and Development Select met on Monday, and they agreed that they would prefer to keep their meetings to the scheduled time of 10 o'clock because that's what suits them. It's only fair to offer the new committee a chance to have the same discussion, so we'll take views from members, please.
Would anybody like to make any points on this? I know Councillor.
Hello. As I said at the Economy and Development Committee, I'm flexible, so I'm happy to fit in with anybody else's requirements. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Eason.
Well, just to aid some discussion, I wasn't speeding this morning, I was being diverted all the way around the county. How about 2 o'clock in the afternoon? Do people feel any differences at all? Any views? Or do we rotate? Let's just discuss something.
Thank you. Councillor Jones.
I'm very happy with as it stands. If we're having a pre-meeting that starts at 9:30, obviously I've got a small child, and as have lots of members now, and therefore after school pickup suits me.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you.
I would rather the afternoon, personally. I would agree with Councillor Eason.
Councillor Davies.
I'm one of the many retired members, so it makes no difference to me, but I would have thought for those members with young children, 10 o'clock in the morning would be more preferable, and that's what the discussion in the Economy and Development Committee came to, that they would, to get most of the members here, that was the best time. Thank you.
Councillor, thank you. Councillor Smith.
Well, I'm flexible in one way, but I personally find that 10 o'clock in the morning is good, a 9:30 meeting, and from the point of view of taking grandchildren here and there, it fits in quite well.
I must admit, as someone who has come from a council where all communities meetings were held in the evening at 7 o'clock, I don't think I'd be very popular, but I do think moving forward, I would be very happy to meet at any time, including the evening, because we have to think about the people that we invite along to our meetings, and it is very difficult sometimes for people to get time off work, and also for people with children to come along with other commitments. But I don't expect I'd be very popular if I suggested a 7 o'clock in the evening meeting. So we've had some suggestions there. Would anybody like to make any other contributions?
I just propose that we leave as is, but if there are people that need to come and we have plenty of advance notice, we can alter it to an evening meeting.
Okay, fine. So are we happy that then for the next meeting we stick to our time of 10 o'clock with a view to perhaps alternating it, which hopefully will enable us to get a high attendance? Are you happy with that, Hazel? Yeah. So I would just like to finish the meeting by confirming the date. Sorry? Oh, sorry.
I thought you were concluding the meeting, but I'd just like to say that thank you very much for your chairmanship today. It's been excellent, and thank you very much indeed.
That's very kind of you to say that. Thank you. So I would just like to confirm the date of the next meeting.